Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation. Today, we're going to explore the fascinating topic of endemism. This is the first slide, so it's our cover slide. We'll be diving into what endemism is, why it matters, and looking at some interesting examples. So, let's get started and discover more about this intriguing subject. When we talk about the word endemic, we're referring to a specific taxonomic unit or taxon that is found in a very limited area. Usually, this area is isolated by natural, geographical, or even temporal barriers. To break that down a bit, in Greek, en means within, and demos means population. So, when we say a species is endemic, we mean it's confined within a specific population or region. These endemic species might only occur in a small geographic area, such as a particular phytogeographical region, a mountain range, or an island. Recognizing these endemic species is crucial because they often have unique adaptations to their local environments, and their restricted distribution makes them especially vulnerable to changes. Throughout this presentation, understanding endemic species helps us appreciate how biodiversity is distributed across different regions, and how isolation can lead to the development of unique species. Endemic elements of a country or region really help us understand several key aspects of its natural history. First, they shed light on the diversity of species that are unique to that particular area, highlighting the rich biological variety. Next, they give us insights into the biogeography, or the distribution patterns of species across the landscape, which tells us a lot about how the region's geography and climate influence life there. These endemic species often point to centers of speciation, places where new species have evolved over time, often in isolation, leading to high levels of endemism. They can also indicate areas of extinction, helping us identify regions where species have vanished, which is crucial for conservation efforts. Finally, endemic elements reveal how species have varied and adapted over time, showcasing the processes of adaptive evolution. By studying these unique species, we can better understand how plants and animals have responded to environmental changes, which ties into the overall theme of biodiversity and conservation. So, in essence, endemic species are like living records of a region's evolutionary history and ecological dynamics. According to Engler, back in 1882, he identified two different forms of endemism. One of these is what we call the endemic area. Now, an endemic area is essentially a specific region where a particular taxonomic unit, whether it's an animal or a plant species, is found. What's important here is that this area has a restricted distribution, meaning the species doesn't occur widely, but rather in a limited, well-defined habitat. This concept helps us understand how certain species are confined to particular regions, which can be crucial when studying biodiversity and conservation efforts. As we move through this presentation, keep in mind how these restricted distributions contribute to the uniqueness of local ecosystems and the importance of protecting these endemic areas. So, when we talk about a population being separated from its surrounding areas, what we're really referring to are barriers that create some sort of division. These barriers can be geographical, physical, ecological, or even temporal in nature. Essentially, they act as obstacles that limit or prevent movement and gene flow between populations. For example, islands and oceans are clear physical barriers. They physically separate land masses and make it difficult for species to migrate or disperse. Mountain ranges serve as physical and ecological barriers. They can be challenging to cross and often create distinct environments on either side. Geographical regions, like deserts or large plains, can also act as barriers by creating different habitats or climates that not all species can adapt to easily. Overall, these barriers are important because they contribute to the formation of distinct populations, which can eventually lead to speciation. Recognizing these barriers helps us understand how diversity is maintained or how new species evolve over time, tying back to our broader theme of understanding biodiversity and evolution. Let's talk about endemic families. This is a broader taxonomic category that relates to the general idea of endemism. When we refer to families in this context, we're looking at groups of plants that are unique to a specific area. That area could be a particular floral province, a region, a country, or even an entire continent. The key point here is that endemic families are those that are exclusive to a defined geographic area, which makes them important for understanding regional biodiversity. Now, moving on to endemic genera. These are even more specific. Endemic genera are found only in a particular region or country that is geographically isolated from other areas. This isolation often leads to the evolution of unique plant groups that aren't found anywhere else. Recognizing endemic genera helps us understand how geographic barriers influence plant evolution and distribution. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding endemism at different taxonomic levels, families and genera, provides insight into how plant diversity is shaped by geographic and ecological factors. It highlights the importance of conserving these unique groups, as they represent the evolutionary history and ecological specificity of their regions. Let's talk about the nature of endemism. Endemism refers to species or taxa that are restricted to a specific region, mountain, or island. Often, these species were once part of a larger, more widespread group, but over time, their distribution has narrowed. This reduction can happen due to climatic or geological changes that alter habitats and force species into smaller areas. To understand how ancient these endemic species are, we look at various clues. Their genetic sequences can tell us a lot about their history, how long they've been isolated. Taxonomic isolation, meaning how distinct they are from related species, also provides insight. Additionally, the type of habitat they occupy and any fossil records can help us gauge their antiquity. All of these features combined help us understand why endemics are so important in studying biodiversity and evolution. They highlight how species adapt and survive in specific conditions, often becoming unique to their environments over time. This understanding ties directly into the broader theme of how species evolve and adapt to their surroundings in isolated or changing habitats. The endemic taxa that we find in some isolated areas are quite fascinating, as they are likely the remnants of their ancient relatives once widespread across continental regions. These isolated populations have survived in these pockets, preserving genetic traits that may have disappeared elsewhere. At the same time, new endemics can emerge in different ecological niches or habitats through a process called speciation. This is essentially how one species can diverge into new, distinct species over time, often driven by genetic variation and environmental factors. There are several mechanisms behind this speciation process. Geographic speciation occurs when populations become physically separated by barriers like mountains or rivers, leading to divergence. Quantum speciation involves rapid genetic changes that produce new species in a relatively short time frame. And then there's sympatric speciation, where new species arise within the same geographic area, often due to differences in ecological roles or behaviors. All of these processes are key to understanding how biodiversity evolves and how isolated populations can give rise to unique, endemic species. They also highlight the dynamic nature of ecosystems and the importance of habitat diversity in fostering new life forms. This connects directly to our overall theme of how species adapt and evolve within their environments over time. Now, let's take a closer look at the categories of endemism. First, we have neo-endemism, which refers to species that have recently evolved and are confined to a specific area. These species are often still expanding their range or have recently become isolated, making them especially interesting for understanding ongoing evolutionary processes. Next, there's paleoendemism, which involves species that have persisted in a particular region for a very long time, often since ancient times. These species are like living fossils, giving us clues about historical biogeography and past climates. Then, we have holoendemism, which describes species that are entirely restricted to a single, specific location. Think of them as truly endemic, with no populations elsewhere. Recognizing these different categories helps us understand not just where species are found, but also their evolutionary history and how they fit into the broader picture of biodiversity. This understanding is crucial as we consider conservation strategies for endemic species and the unique regions they inhabit. Let's talk about neo-endemism, which is a specific type of endemism. Essentially, it describes situations where closely related species develop in the same or nearby areas, but in a different location from where they originally existed. This means that new species can emerge in close proximity to their ancestors, often in neighboring regions. Neo-endemism can develop through several processes. One key factor is mutation, which introduces new genetic variations. Chromosomal rearrangements also play a role, as they can lead to new species by altering the structure of chromosomes. Polyploidy, or the duplication of entire sets of chromosomes, is another important mechanism, especially in plants, because it can instantly create reproductive isolation and new species. Adaptive radiation is also a significant driver here. That's when a single ancestral species diversifies rapidly into many different species, each adapted to specific niches or environments. Lastly, variance in new environments, particularly those with different climatic or soil conditions, pushes species to adapt, leading to the emergence of new endemics. All these processes are interconnected within the broader theme of biodiversity and how species evolve and diversify in response to their environments. Understanding neo-endemism helps us grasp how new species can arise in localized areas, contributing to the rich tapestry of life we see today. Paleoendemism, or ancient endemism, refers to species that have been around for a very long time and are now found only in specific regions. These species are essentially remnants of much older species that once had a broader distribution. They give us a fascinating glimpse into the Earth's past, showing us how certain lineages have persisted in particular areas over geological time. Usually, these species are associated with geologically old land masses, which have remained relatively isolated or stable through the ages. Recognizing paleoendemics helps us understand the historical biogeography of these regions and highlights their importance for conservation, as they often represent unique evolutionary histories. Overall, this concept ties into the larger picture of how Earth's history shapes the distribution of life today. Let's take a closer look at their main characters. First, we have taxonomically isolated components. These are species or groups that don't have closely related species nearby, meaning they're quite unique in their classification. This isolation can tell us a lot about their evolutionary history and how they've adapted over time. Next, there's the presence of similar life forms in isolated taxa, such as on islands or at the tops of mountains. Despite being separated geographically, we often find remarkably similar species in these isolated environments. This phenomenon highlights how similar ecological pressures can lead to convergent evolution, even in species that are otherwise quite distinct. Connecting these points to our overall theme, these characteristics emphasize the importance of geographic isolation and environmental factors in shaping biodiversity. They help us understand how species evolve independently, yet sometimes develop comparable traits when faced with similar conditions. Let's talk about the low level of polyploidy observed in the endemic plant and animal species of this area. Polyploidy, as you know, is when an organism has more than 2 sets of chromosomes, and in this region, such occurrences are quite rare among endemic species. This suggests that these species have maintained relatively stable chromosome numbers over time, which can influence their evolutionary pathways. We also see some possible fossil evidence supporting this idea, hinting at the long-term stability of these species and their genetic makeup. This fossil record helps us piece together how these species might have persisted through environmental changes. Another key point is the major disjunction in the distribution of many endemic species. This means that populations of the same species are separated by significant geographical barriers or distances, leading to isolated groups that may evolve independently. Such disjunctions are important because they shape the genetic diversity and evolutionary trajectories of these species. Lastly, active epibiotics are a particularly interesting group here. These are relict or paleo-endemic species, meaning they are remnants of ancient lineages that have undergone diversification. Despite their ancient origins, they continue to evolve and adapt, contributing to the dynamic nature of this region's biodiversity. Connecting all of these points, it's clear that the evolutionary history and current diversity of endemic species in this area are deeply influenced by their genetic stability, fossil history, geographical distribution, and ongoing evolution. This understanding helps us appreciate the complexity and resilience of these unique ecosystems. Let's talk about endemism. This term refers to a specific phase in the life cycle of endemic species. Basically, it's the period that occurs between their origin, their spread, and possibly their eventual disappearance due to extinction. What's important to understand here is that this phase isn't fixed in time. There's no strict timeline for how long a species remains in this stage. It can vary widely depending on environmental factors, ecological changes, or human impacts. Recognizing this phase helps us appreciate the dynamic nature of endemic species and their vulnerability during these transitional periods. It also ties into the broader theme of how species evolve, adapt, and sometimes face extinction, emphasizing the importance of understanding these processes for conservation efforts. Now, let's look at how endemics are classified based on their cytology. First, we have the paleoendemics, which are species that were once widespread but have now become restricted to a smaller area, often due to extinction of their previous populations. These are typically ancient species that have survived in isolated pockets. Next, we have the schizondemics, which are species that have undergone a process of speciation, leading to the formation of new species from a common ancestor, usually through geographic or reproductive isolation. Then there are the epidemics, a less common group, which are species confined to specific water bodies or aquatic habitats, so their distribution is very limited to particular aquatic environments. Moving on, we have the patrondemics, which are species that exist mainly in their original or ancestral habitats and haven't spread or diversified much beyond those areas. Understanding these categories helps us grasp how different species have evolved and persisted in isolated or specialized environments, which ties into the broader theme of how endemic species contribute to biodiversity and conservation efforts. Today, I want to talk about two important types of endemic species and their roles in understanding biodiversity. First, we have paleoendemics. These are species that are taxonomically isolated, meaning they don't show much variation across their range, and they tend to be found in isolated areas. Essentially, they are remnants of ancient lineages that have persisted in specific locations, often because their habitat has remained stable over long periods. They are like living fossils, giving us clues about past ecosystems. Next, we have schizondemics. These species arise through a process called gradual speciation, which means they originally shared a common ancestor, but have diverged over time as they adapted to different ecological niches. What's interesting is that, despite originating from the same lineage, these species now occur in separate, isolated environments. This separation often leads to unique adaptations suited to their specific niches. Both types highlight how species can become isolated, either through ancient survival in stable habitats or through more recent diversification driven by ecological differences. Understanding these groups helps us see the broader picture of how biodiversity evolves and persists in isolated environments, which ties back to our overall theme of biogeography and conservation. Let's take a closer look at some of the terms related to polyploid origins. First, we have apomictics. These are polyploids that usually originate from hybridization events, often involving widely distributed diploid species. Think of them as hybrids that somehow manage to become stable and reproduce without fertilization. Next, we have patrondemics. These are what we call parent endemics, basically, ellipsoids that serve as the original source for the formation of polyploids. So, in the bigger picture, understanding these terms helps us grasp how polyploid species come into being, whether through hybridization or from specific parent species. This is crucial because it ties into our overall discussion of plant evolution and speciation, highlighting the diverse pathways plants can take to develop new forms. Let's talk about the rarity and extinction of species. Throughout Earth's history, many species have become incredibly rare before they eventually went extinct. Rarity can happen for various reasons, like habitat loss, changes in climate, or competition with other species. When a species becomes very rare, it's more vulnerable to threats, and its chances of survival decrease significantly. Extinction is the natural endpoint for many species, but human activities have accelerated this process dramatically. Understanding why species go extinct helps us appreciate the importance of conservation efforts. It also highlights how interconnected our ecosystems are and why protecting biodiversity is crucial for the health of our planet. This theme ties back to the overall presentation, emphasizing our role in either safeguarding or risking the future of countless species. Over the past few decades, we've seen a worrying decline in the populations of many animal and plant species. This isn't just a small dip. For some, it's been a dramatic decrease to such low levels that they are now considered critically endangered. In fact, some species have already become extinct, meaning they no longer exist anywhere on the planet. The International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, or IUCN, has been at the forefront of addressing this urgent issue. They've played a crucial role in raising awareness and tracking the status of vulnerable species worldwide. One of their most important contributions is the Red Data Book, which they publish periodically. This book serves as a comprehensive list of species that are either threatened with extinction or already extinct. It's a vital tool for conservation efforts because it helps scientists, policymakers, and the public understand which species are most at risk and need immediate attention. Throughout our presentation, we're emphasizing the importance of protecting biodiversity, and the work of the IUCN and their Red Data Book is central to that message. It reminds us of the critical need to take action before it's too late. The world's incredible diversity of flowering plants is truly remarkable, but unfortunately, nearly 1/10 of these species are now dangerously threatened or even on the brink of extinction. When a plant species disappears, it doesn't just vanish from the landscape. It has a ripple effect on the entire ecosystem. Many animals, like insects, higher animals, and even other plants, depend on that specific plant for food, shelter, or breeding. So, the loss of a single plant species can seriously threaten these dependent species as well. In fact, it's estimated that more than half of the animal extinctions in the last 2,000 years are linked to the disappearance of certain plant species. This highlights how interconnected and fragile our ecosystems really are. Protecting plant diversity isn't just about saving individual species, it's about safeguarding the entire web of life that depends on them. This is a vital part of our overall effort to preserve biodiversity and maintain ecological balance. According to the IUCN, on average, about one animal species or subspecies becomes extinct every year. This is a significant figure that highlights the rapid rate at which species are disappearing. It's important to note that this number is relatively higher for plant species, which shows that plants are also facing severe threats, not just animals. This trend underscores the urgent need for conservation efforts across different types of organisms. It connects to the larger theme of biodiversity loss and the importance of protecting our ecosystems for future generations. Let's take a closer look at the process of extinction. Under the natural process of biological evolution, species that are less suited to their environment or unfit tend to become extinct over time. This happens through a mechanism called natural selection, where only the strongest or most adaptable species survive and reproduce. However, it's important to recognize that human interference has significantly sped up this process. Activities like habitat destruction, pollution, overhunting, and introducing invasive species have accelerated the rate at which many species are going extinct. This is a key point because it highlights how human actions are impacting the natural balance of ecosystems. Understanding this process is crucial because it ties directly into our overall theme of conservation and the importance of protecting biodiversity. Now, let's talk about some of the key factors that can lead to the extinction of a particular species. First up is demographic stochasticity, which refers to the random fluctuations in birth and death rates within a small population. These small changes can have a huge impact, especially on endangered species. Next is environmental stochasticity, meaning the unpredictable changes in the environment, like droughts, floods, or temperature shifts, that can threaten a species' survival. Then, we have natural catastrophes, such as earthquakes, wildfires, or hurricanes, which can wipe out entire populations suddenly and dramatically. Lastly, genetic stochasticity involves random changes in the genetic makeup of a population, which can lead to reduced genetic diversity and increased vulnerability to diseases or environmental changes. All these factors tie back to the overall theme of how fragile species are and the importance of understanding these risks to help protect them. Now, let's talk about species that are on the verge of extinction. These species typically have limited abilities to colonize new areas, which makes it difficult for them to expand their populations or recover from setbacks. Their capacity for regeneration is also quite low, meaning they can't bounce back quickly after facing environmental stresses or other challenges. You'll notice that these species usually have relatively small individual populations, which makes them more vulnerable to disturbances. Because their numbers are low, they tend to experience large fluctuations in population size, sometimes booming, but often crashing. This combination of limited colonization, low regeneration capacity, and fluctuating populations really underscores how fragile these species are. It also ties into the broader theme of our presentation, the importance of understanding these vulnerabilities if we want to develop effective conservation strategies. Now let's take a closer look at the causes for extinction. When a species becomes rare, threatened, or even extinct, it's usually due to a combination of factors. These causes can be natural, like environmental changes, or human-induced, such as habitat destruction. Essentially, these factors disrupt the delicate balance that allows species to survive. Some of the most common causes include habitat loss, which happens when natural environments are converted for agriculture, urban development, or other uses. Pollution also plays a significant role, contaminating water, air, and soil, and making it difficult for species to thrive. Overhunting and overfishing can quickly deplete populations, especially when not managed sustainably. Invasive species are another major threat. They can outcompete native species for resources or introduce new diseases. Climate change is increasingly impacting ecosystems worldwide, altering habitats faster than species can adapt. Understanding these causes is crucial because it helps us identify the threats and develop strategies to protect endangered species. After all, recognizing what drives species toward extinction is the first step in preventing it and preserving our planet's rich biodiversity. When we look at environmental causes, we're talking about factors like pollution, climate change, and natural disasters that can significantly impact ecosystems and species survival. These external pressures often lead to habitat loss and can disrupt food chains. Substitutes refer to changes in the environment where one species or resource is replaced by another, which can sometimes lead to competition or imbalance within the ecosystem. For example, if a natural predator disappears, its prey might overpopulate, causing further ecological shifts. Biological causes include things like disease, genetic mutations, or invasive species that disrupt existing balances. These biological factors can weaken populations or introduce new challenges that species aren't adapted to handle. Pathological causes refer to health-related issues, such as parasites or infections, that directly affect the vitality of organisms and can contribute to decline or extinction if widespread. Finally, destruction of habitat is one of the most critical factors. Human activities like deforestation, urbanization, and agriculture lead to the loss of natural spaces, which threatens countless species and undermines biodiversity. All these causes are interconnected and highlight the importance of understanding environmental impacts as part of our overall conservation efforts. When we talk about the rarity of species, we're referring to a situation where there's a sharp decline in the population of a particular species within a specific area, region, or even an entire country. This decline makes the species rare, which is a significant concern for conservation. According to Durry in 1974, a rare species is one that exists in small, widely separated subpopulations. This means the populations are scattered across different locations and are quite limited in size. Because these subpopulations are isolated from each other, interbreeding between them becomes seriously reduced or even impossible in some cases. This reduced gene flow between populations can lead to increased vulnerability. When populations are so fragmented, they're more susceptible to local extinctions, and their overall survival becomes more challenging. So, understanding how and why a species becomes rare helps us grasp the importance of protecting these fragmented populations. It ties into the broader theme of biodiversity conservation, highlighting the urgency of maintaining species before they become critically endangered or extinct. The causes for the rarity of animal or plant species are often linked to their specific biological and ecological characteristics. For example, when an animal species is large in size, it typically requires a larger habitat to meet its needs. If that habitat is narrow or limited, it can make the species more vulnerable to becoming rare. Additionally, species with narrow tolerance to environmental conditions, meaning they can only survive within a specific range of temperature, humidity, or other factors, are more likely to be rare because any change in their environment can threaten their survival. Another important factor is reproductive traits. Species that have a long gestation period and produce only a few litters each year tend to have slower population growth. This makes it harder for them to recover from threats or declines, increasing their rarity. Similarly, for plants, rarity can occur when they are found only in a narrow habitat range. If a plant species has low climatic tolerance, meaning it can only survive within a very specific set of environmental conditions, any disturbance or change in those conditions can drastically reduce their population. All these factors, size, habitat specificity, environmental tolerance, reproductive rates, are interconnected and contribute to why certain species become rare. Recognizing these causes helps us understand the importance of conserving those species with such specialized requirements, as they are naturally more vulnerable. So, one of the major issues we're seeing is the large-scale destruction of habitats and ecosystems for both animals and plants. When we build roads through previously inaccessible mountainous regions, it's not just about creating a route for travel. It actually opens up these areas to a whole range of external factors that weren't a concern before. This exposure can lead to habitat fragmentation and degradation, which significantly affects the local wildlife and plant life. As these terrains become more accessible, they face increased threats like deforestation, poaching, and human encroachment. All of these factors contribute to a decline in populations, sometimes quite rapidly. It's a chain reaction where opening up these areas might seem beneficial for development or connectivity, but it often comes at a serious cost to biodiversity and ecosystem health. This point ties back to our overall theme of how human activities, especially infrastructure development, have far-reaching impacts on our natural world. It's a reminder that we need to balance progress with the preservation of these vital ecosystems. Now, let's talk about threat values of species. When we want to understand why a species is declining in number, it's crucial to identify the specific threats they face. This helps us carry out detailed scientific studies and, importantly, develop effective corrective measures. Essentially, knowing the nature of the threat allows us to target our conservation efforts more precisely. Whether it's habitat destruction, poaching, pollution, or invasive species, each threat impacts animals and plants differently. So, by pinpointing these threats, we can better understand the challenges and work towards safeguarding these species for the future. This step is a vital part of the overall conservation process. Peering and Forwell in 1977 proposed a practical way to assess how threatened a species might be. They introduced specific criteria that help us evaluate the risk level. Essentially, each category related to a species, vulnerability, is assigned an index value. These values are then added together to calculate an overall threat score. The key idea here is that the total threat value gives us a clear picture of how at risk a species is. If the total score falls between 4 and 15, that species is considered to be threatened. This method provides a systematic, quantifiable way to identify species that need conservation attention. By understanding and applying these criteria, we can better prioritize our efforts and resources to protect those species most at risk, aligning with the overall goal of biodiversity conservation. Now, let's take a closer look at the rate of decline in a species population over a decade of observation. On this slide, we have an index value that helps us classify how much the population has decreased. An index value of 0 indicates a decline of less than 33%, which suggests a relatively moderate decrease. When the index value is 1, it signifies a decline between 33 and 66%, pointing to a more significant reduction that could impact the species' survival. Finally, an index value of 3 represents a decline of more than 66%, which is quite alarming and indicates a severe decline that warrants urgent conservation efforts. Understanding these classifications helps us gauge the severity of population declines and prioritize our conservation actions accordingly. This ties into our overall theme of monitoring and protecting vulnerable species before their declines become irreversible. Now, let's take a closer look at this slide, which highlights the number of localities from where we have gathered data. Essentially, this gives us an idea of the geographic spread of our research or observations. The key point here is that the more localities we include, the more comprehensive our understanding becomes. It helps us identify patterns or variations that might be region-specific. This is particularly important because it connects directly to our overall goal of understanding the distribution and prevalence across different areas. By analyzing data from multiple localities, we can make more informed conclusions and recommendations. So, in summary, this slide emphasizes the importance of the breadth of our data collection efforts and how it strengthens the overall robustness of our findings. Now, let's talk about the subjective assessment of the species. When we refer to this, we're really focusing on how experts or observers perceive and interpret the species based on their own experience and judgment. This approach is important because it allows us to incorporate nuanced insights that might not be captured through purely objective measures. However, it's also essential to remember that subjective assessments can vary between observers, influenced by their individual backgrounds and biases. That's why, in our overall evaluation, we often combine these subjective insights with more objective data to get a well-rounded understanding. This concept ties directly into our broader theme of comprehensive species evaluation, where both scientific data and expert judgment work together to inform us about species health, behavior, and conservation needs. So, appreciating the subjective perspective adds depth and context to our overall assessment process. Now, let's take a closer look at the conservation index for this particular species. This index is a crucial tool because it helps us understand how at risk or vulnerable a species might be. It's essentially a measure that combines various factors like population size, habitat quality, and threats to give us a comprehensive picture of the species' conservation status. The higher the conservation index, the greater the concern, indicating that the species might need more urgent conservation efforts. Conversely, a lower index suggests that the species is relatively stable or less threatened. This index is important because it guides us in prioritizing conservation actions. By focusing on species with higher indices, we can allocate resources more effectively and work towards protecting those most at risk. Throughout this presentation, we've discussed the importance of understanding species statuses to inform our conservation strategies. The conservation index is a key part of that puzzle It helps us make data-driven decisions to preserve biodiversity and maintain ecological balance. Let's talk about the remoteness of the locality. When a place is far from urban centers or major hubs, it can significantly impact accessibility. This remoteness often means limited transportation options, which can make it harder for people to reach services or markets. It can also lead to higher costs for goods and services, since transportation becomes more expensive. Furthermore, remoteness can affect the availability of resources, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure development. This can lead to challenges in improving living standards and economic opportunities for residents. Understanding this aspect is crucial because it ties into the overall theme of development and sustainability. Addressing remoteness requires targeted strategies, like improving connectivity or local resource management, to ensure that even the most isolated areas can thrive. Now, let's move on to the next important aspect: accessibility, specifically how easy it is to access the site once you've located it. This is a crucial part of the overall user experience because even if the site is easy to find, if it's difficult to access afterward, it can create frustration. When we talk about accessibility here, we're focusing on the ease of navigating from the point of discovery to actually reaching the content or services. Think about factors like clear pathways, intuitive design, and minimal barriers. If a site is well designed in this regard, users can move seamlessly from searching to engaging with the content. This ties into the larger theme of creating user-centric experiences, making sure every step, from access to interaction, is smooth and straightforward. Ultimately, accessibility isn't just about physical ease. It's about ensuring everyone can reach and use the site effectively, regardless of their technical skills or devices. Let's take a look at the different categories of existence that help us understand how various species are faring in the world today. First, we have the normal category, which includes species that are currently stable and thriving without immediate threats. These are the species we often consider as common or abundant. Moving on, the endangered category refers to species that are at a very high risk of extinction in the wild if we don't take action. These species need our urgent attention to prevent their disappearance. Next, the vulnerable category includes species that are facing a high risk of endangerment in the medium term. They're not as critically at risk as endangered species, but still require monitoring and conservation efforts. Then, we have rare species, which are those that are naturally scarce or have a limited distribution. While they might not be immediately threatened, their rarity makes them especially interesting and important to protect. Finally, the extinct category signifies species that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Recognizing where species fall within these categories helps us understand the overall health of biodiversity and highlights the importance of conservation. Each category tells a story about the current state of our planet's life forms and underscores the urgency of our efforts to preserve the richness of life on Earth. Now, let's talk about species that are in danger of extinction. The survival of these species is really challenging if the negative factors that cause their decline keep going. These factors might include habitat destruction, pollution, hunting, or climate change. Endangered species are those whose populations have dropped to a critical level, making recovery difficult without intervention. They also include species whose habitats are under threat, which means their living environments are being damaged or lost. Understanding this helps us see how crucial it is to protect these species and their habitats to prevent them from becoming extinct. It's a vital part of our overall effort to preserve biodiversity and maintain healthy ecosystems. Now, let's talk about endangered species. These are species that are at risk of extinction. Their survival becomes really challenging if the negative factors that cause their decline continue to persist. For example, habitat destruction, pollution, or poaching can all threaten their existence. Endangered species include those whose populations have been reduced to critical levels, meaning there are very few individuals left. They also include species whose habitats are under serious threat, making it difficult for them to survive and reproduce. Recognizing these species is crucial because it highlights the importance of conservation efforts to prevent their extinction and protect biodiversity as a whole. Now, let's talk about species that are classified as vulnerable. These are species whose populations have already declined significantly. The key point here is that their numbers are approaching a critical threshold. If the negative factors impacting them, like habitat loss, pollution, or overexploitation, continue unchecked, these species are likely to move into the endangered category soon. Essentially, being vulnerable is a warning sign. It highlights the urgent need for conservation efforts to prevent further decline. This ties into the overall theme of the presentation, which is about understanding different risk levels and prioritizing actions to protect our biodiversity. Recognizing vulnerable species helps us focus on those most at risk of becoming endangered if we don't intervene. Now let's talk about species that are classified as rare. These are species with small global populations, but at the moment, they are not considered endangered or vulnerable. However, the key point here is that they are still at considerable risk. Their populations are small enough that any negative factors, like habitat loss, pollution, or overhunting, could tip them into a more threatened category. So, while they might seem stable right now, there's a real possibility they could become endangered or vulnerable if these harmful influences persist. This highlights the importance of early intervention and ongoing conservation efforts to prevent further decline. It reminds us that rarity alone doesn't guarantee safety, and we need to stay vigilant to protect these species from moving into more critical categories. Now let's talk about species that are classified as extinct. These are species that, after repeated searches in areas where they were likely to be found, whether that's a local habitat, a region, or even across an entire continent, simply haven't been seen. In fact, thorough searches have failed to turn up any individuals. It's important to understand that extinction can occur at different levels. A species might be extinct in a specific local area, but still survive elsewhere. Conversely, it could be completely wiped out across an entire continent or even on a global scale. This concept highlights the seriousness of extinction and the importance of conservation efforts. Once a species is gone, especially globally, it's a permanent loss, not just of a single creature, but of the unique role it played in its ecosystem. So, recognizing when a species is truly extinct helps us understand the urgency of protecting our biodiversity before it's too late. Let's talk about the importance of a status report. Essentially, it's a comprehensive update on the health of a specific species or group of species within a certain region or country. When preparing such a report, there are several key points to consider. First is taxonomy, which helps us understand exactly what species we're dealing with and how they are classified. Next is the historical range, meaning the area where the species used to thrive, giving us a baseline to compare current conditions. Then we look at current population levels and trends. Are numbers increasing, stable, or declining? This helps us gauge the species' overall health. Finally, we assess the threats facing the population. These could be habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, or other risks. Connecting all these points allows us to develop effective conservation strategies and track progress over time, tying back to the overall goal of preserving biodiversity and ensuring sustainable ecosystems. When we talk about being on the verge of extinction, we're referring to species that are teetering at the edge of disappearing completely. This means their populations are declining so rapidly that, without prompt action, they could vanish from our planet entirely. It's a critical warning sign, highlighting how urgent it is to implement conservation measures now. Throughout this presentation, we've seen how human activities and environmental changes contribute to these declines. Recognizing when a species is on the brink helps us understand the importance of immediate intervention to prevent irreversible loss. So, being on the verge of extinction is more than just a phrase. It's a call to action to protect our planet's biodiversity before it's too late. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share these insights with you. Remember, the key points we've discussed highlight the importance of applying these strategies to achieve success. I hope you found this presentation both informative and inspiring. If you have any questions or want to explore these ideas further, please feel free to reach out. Once again, thank you for being here and for your engagement throughout this session.